Good afternoon, everybody, and it's my honor as interim dean, my name is Bob Rawson, to welcome all of you to our law school and to this distinguished lecture. I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of the Center for Interdisciplinary Study of Conflict and Dispute Resolution, which we affectionately refer to as SISTER, because it's a little easier to get out than the whole name. But we're very proud of what the center does. I want to begin by recognizing our professor, Calvin Sharp, who sits over to my left, your right. It's Calvin who is the director of the center and who is the animating force behind not only this lecture, but the thought that goes into our providing through the center the kinds of programming that we do that has to do with interdisciplinary approaches to conflict resolution. SISTER sponsors 3 annual lectures that focus on the theory and practice of conflict and dispute resolution. This is the 3rd lecture in a series dedicated to interdisciplinary insights that inform our understanding and help us respond more appropriately to problems of conflict and dispute resolution. And I emphasize the notion of interdisciplinary approaches because that is, I think, a differentiating characteristic of our center. There are other, obviously, places around the country and the world which focus upon, as they should, and deal with conflicts in the way they should be resolved. But the approach of our center is to do it with an interdisciplinary emphasis. Today's interdisciplinary lecture is the 3rd one since the launching of the center, and the inaugural lecture was given by Dr. Maya Angelou, who, as you know, is a poet, and the 2nd by Stephen Post, a bioethicist. Today's lecture is given by a sociologist, an interesting balance to the other 2, I think you'll agree. He's a professor of sociology at Brandeis. He's written over 150 articles and 3 books. And Calvin tells me that what piqued his interest in the work of our speaker was his book entitled Rambo and the Dalai Lama, The Compulsion to Win and Its Threat to Human Survival, because of its many insights about conflict and dispute resolution. But his considerable work on conflict has also included 2 other works. The first, The Deceived Majority, Politics and Protest in Middle America. And as I think about the title, I think it resonates with the moment we are presently living in. And it'll be interesting to hear our speaker connect his insights into that to the current circumstances which we face on all kinds of issues. And the second piece, called The Nuclear Seduction, Why the Arms Race Doesn't Matter and What Does. He also has produced a video called This is the Moment, Israelis and Palestinians Talking Peace, once again, reflecting the concerns of the moment, as well as what has been passed and what will certainly come in the future. I'm sure, in other words, that we're in for quite a treat today, and I ask you to join me in welcoming our Lewis C. Greenwood lecturer, Professor Gordon Fellman, whose lecture is entitled Ceasefire, The Case for Ending War. Dr. Fellman.
It was really a nice introduction. Let me know if this is loud enough. Can you hear in the back? Is this okay? Okay, fine. A little louder, okay. Let's bend this forward here. How's that? That can be okay? Or can this be turned up a little bit? Is there anybody? Well, I'll just try to speak loud. If I'm not loud enough, raise your hand or wave at me or something, and I will surely respond. I want to thank Professor Sharp for inviting me here. It turns out I learned only this morning that he was a colleague as an arbitrator of my older brother, who died a hideous degenerative death 2 years ago. And it's especially meaningful for me to be here knowing and having that connection with you. What I'm going to talk about now is a kind of a summary or a précis of a book I'm writing. I'm trying to write a popular book for the first time. I've never done that before, and it makes me work on vocabulary in a different way I do in academic work, and also to have a minimum of footnotes. But here's what I want to say, and I open this up to full discussion. I'm glad, by the way, to be part of your continuing education. I just found out that was the series that I'm in. I'm going to read this because I get more into my talk when I read it than when I ad-lib it, although it's more fun to ad-lib. In a major economic recession, money is needed for countless projects. Saving the banking system, helping mortgagees hold on to their homes, reducing unemployment, and much, much more. The crisis is such that decision makers cut back on public services like education, libraries, parks, and countless other expenses. Where policymakers despair is the money to come from to save us from economic ruin. There are two obvious places where vast piles of money lie to bail out our aching economy. One is the wealth of the super rich. Thanks to the tax policies of a succession of presidents, the fortunes of the upper class have become sacrosanct, untouchable even for the public good. The other place where there is vast money that could be used to restore and renew our economy and our society is also ordinarily unassailable: war spending. It is time to question both these peculiar situations, but the one I intend to take on here is the sacred aura over war preparation and war. I claim that war is no longer necessary, and that most of the funds for it can be shifted to meet the needs of billions of civilians in their everyday lives. I am then taking on war itself as an institution which has been with us for thousands of years. War begins with agriculture about 10,000 years ago. So it's a bit awesome and perhaps arrogant of me to take that on, but I'm doing it anyway. I intend to suggest that in our era, war persists very heavily because of the role it plays in sustaining economies, that of the U.S. in particular, because of the idea and reality of the warrior as the epitome of masculinity in this and many other cultures, and because of the need of all societies to channel anger away from its real objects and redirect it somewhere else. I think that's about as interdisciplinary as I can get. I must say that I was in a graduate program that combined social anthropology, sociology, social psychology, and clinical psychology, and have been interdisciplinary my whole professional life. I was thrilled to find there was a place here that honored that. So I do not mean to suggest that these three, the economy, masculinity, and anger, are the only reasons for war, but rather to focus on them as elements essential to keeping it going. I also aim to suggest that there are ways to come to terms with these reasons for war that would ease our way toward creating a world of peace. Business, masculinity, and anger, then, are the three lenses through which I intend to examine war and the possibility of ending it. I know that seems impossibly ambitious and to some foolhardy and childish, but problems are never resolved by throwing one's hands up in despair or assuming they are insoluble. Those of us on the sidelines can and should appreciate and respect warriors who put their lives on the line and wind up victorious or bitter, injured, or dead. We can thank and admire the chances they took and the pain of failures beyond their control. Yet because we imagine that in some way the ultimate triumph of the warriors would be to bring war to an end, warriors can be asked to join peace seekers in questioning the wisdom of those leaders who sent them to what commonly turn out to be futile wars, and ask them to join in questioning whether it makes sense any longer to have wars at all. The free market is the only economic system humans have devised that operates so efficiently and with such success that it is able to produce more than can be consumed. Because continuing growth is built into the idea and practice of our economic system, and because of the tendency toward overproduction, the system has one gigantic way of expanding and ensuring that it can make ever more money. This way is called consumerism, and it takes two specific forms: civilian consuming and war consuming. There are two types of civilians consuming. One is goods and services for sustainability. That means food, clothing, shelter, healthcare, education, transportation, ways and places to express spiritual tendencies, arts, recreation, and forms of entertainment that contribute to individual health, mental stimulation, growth, and emotional well-being, and that also contribute to building and sustaining communities where lives take place. So although growth is built into our economic system, it is likely that in a different kind of economic system, a zero growth goal could be devised to handle the project of sustainability. The second kind of civilian consuming necessary to a growth economy is surplus goods and services. These are what people don't need, but which they can be persuaded to want. This means convincing people, mainly through advertising, to buy whatever is for sale. The clearest example in recent times might be bottled water that is thousands of times more expensive than completely safe, tasty, and adequate tap water. There are also appliances and clothing that wear out before they need to, were they better constructed, nicotine that is a legal way to poison people, cars that are not so safe as they might be and use more fuel than they have to, and countless other items any of you can start naming right now. Global consumerism is an extension of what I am calling civilian consumerism. It is consumerism that can be forced on developing countries. They are markets for both sustainable products and luxury products. The former are sold to their masses of people, imported food, clothing, cell phones, and the like, and the latter are sold to their elites, expensive cars, furnishings, appliances, jewelry, vacations, and so on. Almost all developing countries are run by elites who help organize the country in the interests of the elites of the developed world, and who live at very high levels of consumption and learn to steel themselves against the reality of suffering of most of the people in their societies. The less economically developed nations, usually too poor to provide survival essentials for all of their populations, are sucked into a world economic system that needs them as sources of cheap raw materials and cheap labor, and as customers for both essential and inessential things, so that the first world economies selling the stuff continue to grow. Beyond civilian and global consumerism, the free market system has another gigantic and crucial way to manage that problem of surplus productivity. It is one thing to sell cigarettes, clothing, food, and cars to another country. It is another to sell weapons. This brings us to war consumerism, the making and selling of stuff that does not even have to be used to be profitable for those behind it. The United States sells more arms than all other countries in the world, even though our first and most significant customer is ourselves. How does the United States interest developing countries in buying arms produced here? One way is by not having a policy of doing everything it can to prevent wars. The other is by marketing. The U.S. public, through our taxes, allows the United States government every year to spend $6 to $7 billion of tax money for marketing and sales of arms to other countries. There are arms fairs everywhere that we pay for. Taxpayers also pay for research and development. In the non-war sectors of the economy, ordinarily companies finance their own research and development. It is no secret that countries buying armaments are more likely to use them than countries that do not. Our system seems to wash its hands after the sale is closed. In the immortal words of the 60s satirical songwriter Tom Lehrer, speaking of the once Nazi, later U.S. missile expert Wernher von Braun, once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department, says Wernher von Braun. The business of war is a vast, vast business. In 2005, the U.S. defense budget was about equal to all other nations' defense budgets combined. That proportion has held in the years since then. In addition to what it spends on our own military, the U.S. government sells almost half the weapons bought in the world, or 45.8% in 2005. Whether or not those arms sold contribute to self-defense, in addition to war-making capabilities, they inevitably undermine possible diplomatic and other nonviolent alternatives to war. A 1998 study estimated that during the Cold War, the United States spent $2 trillion in 1996 dollars on strategic nuclear forces. $320.5 billion was spent on ballistic missile submarines, only one of which was ever necessary, by the way, $97 billion on nuclear missiles, and $46 billion on research, development, testing, production, and operations. Our government continues to build nuclear submarines, or rather pays to have them built. There is no need for these submarines. The chances that they will be used in war are probably just about zero. The submarines are not only not likely to be employed, they don't even have to work. They are there to keep some jobs in Connecticut and to make gorgeous profits for their makers, period. Similarly with the F-22 fighter plane, the White House and the Defense Department did not want them and actually had to fight industry and lobbyists to cut out the last part of the original order. These planes are extremely expensive to make and to service, have never been used, and most likely never will be involved in any action of any kind. Is pouring huge amounts of money into highly sophisticated weapons that will not be employed madness? And if not madness, what is it? Chalk up business is one reason war keeps going in this era. We turn now to normative masculinity as a second reason. The masculinity that most of us are familiar with assumes that men have to be tough, hard, and determined to get ahead or even just to get along in the world. Increasingly, these assumptions are recommended to women too, and taken on by many of them as well. The man's man is devoted, loyal, hard, confident, daring, courageous, ruthless if need be, and determined to win whatever is there for winning. This trope reaches its fullest flower in the warrior. War itself embodies at the extreme what is noble about normative masculinity and also what is deadly. Normative masculinity worships a real man as someone who is self-sufficient, someone who doesn't need anyone else. The cowboy, the loner, the self-made man, the godfather, the empire builder, the warrior, the general, the commander, the king. War draws a huge range of reactions. Some loathe it, some hate it, some love it, some crave it, some find it the ultimate game, some thrill to the quiver of danger. They bask in the do-or-die challenges of battles, strategies, clashes with enemies, and hoped-for victories. They honor country, religion, family, whatever they understand themselves to be fighting to preserve and to protect. It is not hard to be awestruck by the rigorous training that turns youths into warriors, pushing their strong and willing bodies to the limits of strain, their limits of fear, their limits of risk, their limits of endurance, of pain, of exhaustion. The body, soul, and heart of the warrior are hardened to confront the enemy and to bend every fiber to subdue, to vanquish, to crush, to destroy, to win. Most people's lives are pretty tame, even boring. Henry David Thoreau claimed, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." We can say by now the mass of people lead lives of quiet desperation. What could make the pulse beat faster, the heart leap higher, muscles respond more perfectly than battle, than war itself? Stories are legendary of warriors discovering themselves in combat to be more alive, more real, more fully engaged than anywhere else they can imagine. What is deadly about war is at the end of it, the environment is damaged, entire towns and cities are destroyed, infrastructure is in ruins, and large numbers of humans are dead. Grief abounds, families are torn apart, and war casualties live what remain of their lives with shattered bodies and psyches. Whatever its glories and challenges, war is ultimately about destroying. War is about death. War is about death. War is about death. Yet war persists. It is as if it has a momentum that cannot be stopped. It thrives also on the reality that normative men tend to be paranoid. They sense there is always someone who has it in for them. It is crucial for most normative men to believe there was someone out to get them. They, in turn, are committed to being out to get someone else. This assumption practically drives behavior in institutions like politics, business, sport, and others still. It is easy to create enemies, and doing this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is part of the sick dynamic of paranoia in normative masculinity. Men tend, these are vast generalizations, of course, please take them as such. Men tend to fear authority, and when the authority is formally above them in a chain of command, they tend to knuckle under to it. Normative men submit to authorities that tell them that what they have to do in order to be adequately male, and they usually obey instructions that come from authorities above, whether religious figures, political leaders, presidents of organizations, bosses at work, or anyone else. To be a real equal with someone is to be able to challenge their authority when you believe it is misused or simply wrong. Normative men may grumble about what they perceive as unjust authority, but swallowing and taking it is far more common than confronting it. Normative men also tend to fear the softer human qualities, at least in public. They fear failure. They fear weakness. They fear women. They fear intimacy. They fear other men. They fear passivity, and especially significant, they fear change. It takes daring and imagination to allow for criticizing what is and envisioning something more satisfying and fulfilling. Real men are taught to reject daring except in combat, war, business, politics, sport, and so on. They forego the sublime pleasures of making things better for themselves and for other people, and they forego the transcendent joys of imagination. Not for nothing did no less a figure than Albert Einstein say that imagination is more important than knowledge. Change is not possible without its first being imagined. Normative men are taught to mistrust such possibilities. Realism, as used in political science now, but also in general, realism is an ideology of normative masculinity which assumes more or less that what is because it has to be. Normative men are reluctant even to think about ending war, so fearful are they of what that might mean for the sense of themselves as men and for the assumed taboo on imagining real change in society. There's another reason normative men fear change and fear peace. Those conditions would threaten to destabilize familiar pattern ways of releasing anger. And now my third topic. All societies have to figure out how to manage what might be called surplus anger in their populations. Anger is an exceptionally strong and problematic emotion that can lead to very antisocial behavior. Anger ordinarily surfaces in response to hurts, slights, humiliation, disappointments, and the like. The contexts eliciting anger are usually family, work, school, community, government, and institutions like religion, sport, and others as well. The point is that people are ordinarily discouraged or forbidden from confronting the sources of their anger. Anger threatens stability and authority, but has somehow to be expressed anyway. To me, one of the remarkable developments in our society in recent decades is the emergence of media figures whose major task seems to be organizing the anger of masses of discontented people and channeling it into hatred of women, homosexuals, people of color, Democrats, President Obama, healthcare reform, and anything else they can get a handle on to stir up and heat those anger juices to the point of a volatile concoction with serious political consequences. I consider Limbaugh, O'Reilly, Coulter, and Beck, to take perhaps the most famous of them, to be absolute masters of redirecting anger from its real objects to fake ones. How more brilliant can anyone be than to shift anger at a failing and profit-ridden healthcare system to the people who want to change it? Emotions are plastic, and all it takes is a little bit of skill to shift them from one location to another. Societies evolve options for deflecting anger from its original object that run all the way from turning it inward in the form of self-castigation, accident proneness, compulsive failing, neurosis, psychosis, suicide, and other ways of unnecessarily limiting the self's aspirations and accomplishments, all the way from those ways of turning anger inward to systematic pouring of anger into what I call anger structures. All forms of domination, such as racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism, are, among other things, anger structures. They allow people in the dominating positions to mistreat those below them and to allow the victims to complain about their overlords, but to take out their anger on peers, family members, and public figures, rather than on the real sources of their anger. There is a song from a Broadway musical of the mid-20th century that makes this point painfully clear. The play is South Pacific. How many of you know that, possibly? Okay, well, the play is South Pacific, which tries to show its post-World War II audience, the musical opened in 1949, how ridiculous racism is. The song is called You've Got to Be Carefully Taught. Forgive me for singing this. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be taught from year to year. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made, of people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be carefully taught. As the lyrics suggest, anybody can be taught to hate anybody. Unless it is put aside, and it's not easy to do this, our anger has to go somewhere. Parents who set off rage in their children for whatever reason do not allow it to be dealt with directly in a healthy way open the door to the child finding other objects than the parent to let out its anger. It is routine in society that many people learn to direct their anger onto people whose skin is a different color, or who belong to a different religion, or another ethnic group, or another nation, or another gender, or another sexual orientation, or anything else at all. Further, men are routinely taught that it is permissible to physicalize their anger. It can go into fighting, rape outside of or even inside marriage, and battles all the way from those common on playgrounds to those outside bars in the wee hours of the morning to gang fights of any kind anywhere. The physicalization of anger culminates in war, of course, takes the tame form in sport where the other team is opposed for a few hours or maybe longer, but not in potentially deadly ways. But the physicalization of anger reaches its apogee in war. Entire populations are taught to hate an enemy about whom they usually know nothing and to sanction others going abroad to kill in the name of that hatred, disguised usually in some ideological way. Among its many meanings, the Cold War was a stylized, rigid anger structure that was stable, even if stupid, for about 45 years. Without the Soviet Union as an enemy, our society has floundered about looking for a successor. Arabs? Muslims? To some extent and sort of, but terrorists won the prize. And because it is difficult to defeat them in ordinary warfare, the threat of terrorists could be mobilized for a very long time to keep societies in order and to displace ordinary citizens' anger away from its real objects. One of the surprising things about the continuation of hot wars, as in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that people in this country seem to get used to them without fully demonizing Afghans and Iraqis. I suspect there is a low-level unconscious pleasure in knowing those wars go on, so that at least some of the free-floating anger that flesh is heir to can have a steady if uncertain object upon which to light. And now I want to go, that's kind of part one of my analysis. Now I'm going to something I call moving beyond war. I turn now to imagining constructs and processes that can take us beyond war. I will begin by combining my analysis of normative masculinity with my analysis of socially destructive uses of anger. The very effort to make peace rather than war is widely seen by normative men as feeble, pathetic, wimpy. The image of peace as weak and somehow pitiful, though, does not make any logical sense. It is rather part and parcel of normative masculinity, based more on fear and confusion than on true daring and strength. Peace would rob such men of one of the principal outlets for anger that they have learned to take for granted, that of full immersion in anger structures. If we agree that normative masculinity in some crucial ways has run its course, then what might a reconstructed masculinity look like? First of all, it would recognize that making peace is a greater challenge than making war. After all, we have a huge history of knowing how to make war. We know how to train people to fight, how to produce lethal weapons and means of delivering them, how to strategize for battle, and how to contract out countless aspects of making war and cleaning up afterwards. Making peace is far more difficult and a vastly greater challenge than making war. It is all the same a task whose time has come. Surviving on our planet from now on demands it, I claim. Real men make peace. They are not afraid of peace. Real men value human life, dignity, and the integrity of the environment above military victory. Real men take up the task of how to resolve conflicts without violence, an incredibly more difficult job than making war. Real men do not shrink from this challenge. They choose the harder and more urgent undertaking, making peace, over the less demanding and in most ways more costly one, making war. In the reconstructed masculinity I'm imagining, restraining anger would be seen as a greater challenge than expressing it, either physically or socially, against other people. It would be understood that holding back anger requires more courage and strength than expressing it. It would also be understood that the same anger that goes into being a racist can be poured into being anti-racist, and so with war and anything else. Let's see, skip this little part here. Now I'm going to talk about what I call the world's first grassroots movement. If reconceptualizing normative manhood is one step beyond war, another opens up the possibility of what could become the world's first global grassroots movement. War and preparations for war cost around half the annual federal budget in the United States. Almost all countries spend more than they need to on military hardware and preparedness. This is the heart of the war business. What would peace business look like? In 2008, Congressperson Barney Frank of Massachusetts suggested that the defense budget could be reduced by 25% at no harm to defense of the U.S. David Swanson, in an article called Frank Breaks Taboo on Military Spending, reports that, I'm quoting Swanson now, for the fiscal year 2009, we're looking at $653 billion for the Pentagon, plus $162 billion in supplemental funding for Iraq and Afghanistan. A quarter of $850 billion, the total of those two figures, a quarter of $850 billion is $203.75 billion. Anyone who couldn't figure out where to cut $203.75 billion from the Pentagon is probably a danger to themselves and others. You could get $162 billion by ending two horribly damaging foreign occupations. You could get $73.7 billion just by ending the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, the people who brought you mechanical killer elephants and telepathic warfare, people who are now researching exploding frisbees, cyborg wasps, and Captain America no meals and no sleep soldiers. We spend money on this. That would be $235.7 billion right there. Imagine if you shut down some of the 1,000 or so bases we're imposing on other people's countries, building animosity around the globe. Or what if we were to shut down missile defense? Obama's at least gone partway toward that. Or abandon all space weapons programs until, there was a sane argument for them. Let's face it, Frank's proposal is disgustingly and immorally conservative. Now, the grassroots movement, I imagine, would in every country demand a cut of, say, a quarter to a third in defense budgets over a 3-year period, then another third over the next 3 years. The goal would be to reduce all military organization to that needed for defense only. This, of course, would require international cooperation and enforceable treaties. Challenges, to be sure, but if human survival requires this, and I believe it does, we have to start somewhere. There is a term handy for how to switch war production to peace production, because we have to worry about the people who lose their jobs making weapons and so on. The term is economic conversion, a process by which companies and their employees would work together to figure out how, say, to move from building nuclear submarines to building efficient, environmentally friendly mass transit systems. For understandable reasons, investors making money off one form of productivity are reluctant to go to the bother and risks of shifting to another. There would probably have to be involvement of companies, think tanks, universities, and governments to work effectively on these challenging but resolvable problems. If there's time in discussion, I can tell you about some economic conversion ideas that are already on the table, or have been on the table. Second, a global truth and reconciliation process. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which has been used in over 30 countries by now, rejects the winner-loser idea. The claim that winning is everything is blind to the reality that winning is often gained by horribly immoral means, and that the victims of those means do not accept the legitimacy of the process that seems normal and acceptable to the winners. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions document human rights violations and sometimes recommend ways to avoid their repetition in the future. They are sponsored by governments, non-governmental organizations, or both. TRCs have played significant roles in helping people face the history of organized violence in their societies. The best known one is in South Africa, by the way. Bishop Tutu headed that commission. A South African professor named John Daniel has an extraordinary idea that draws upon the TRC experience. Daniel says he thinks it is time for truth and reconciliation processes that will deal with a different level of conflicts, those in the past whose effects linger mightily. He's talking about the facts and consequences of the division of the world into colonies by European powers 2 to 4 centuries ago, and the continuing conflicts and tragedies stemming from this. Vast destruction has been done in the world by the colonialists who traveled mostly from Europe and later from North America to Africa, Asia, and Latin America from the 16th century on. The main reason was commerce, finding and controlling raw materials for industry, finding and controlling markets for trade, finding and controlling cheap labor for mining, farming, lumbering, and manufacture. The damage done to environments, cultures, social structures, and psyches was vast. We have yet, as a world, to figure out how to deal with the hideous legacies of colonialism and imperialism. We continue to live with some of the terrible effects of those times in history, in that even now, commercial interests, protected by the flags and militaries of nations working on their behalf, still ravage the earth and its inhabitants. This is part of what we now call globalization, and therein lies one great seed of the enormous turmoil in the world today. The heirs of the people who suffered from those historical processes could feel relief to understand how so many of their society's agonies stem from the realities of colonialism and imperialism. It could help them come to terms with what it means for a society to be viciously ravaged and its development set back so horribly that recovery from colonialism and imperialism is, for many people, still a long, long way off. Imagine a great series of investigations into what really happened in the colonial and imperial periods, and some process of acknowledgement and reconciliation between the descendants of those who profited and the descendants of those who suffered, and who continue to suffer what was done to devastate their economies and societies 200 years ago. Imagine media used not just to distract people from their daily personal and social cares, but instead that the talents of producers, writers, historians, anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, set designers, actors, directors, and publicists were used to make vivid and alive what really happened in India, in Indonesia, in Congo, in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Brazil, in Mexico, in Bolivia, and in the scores of other places colonized and wrecked by foreign powers making money. There could be extraordinary wonder and fascination in seeing history from the point of view of victim peoples, and in learning how and why colonialism and imperialism destroyed so much and generated such tragic havoc and resentment as continues even to this day. Knowing the truth, the central issue in the truth and reconciliation process, is an end in itself. Just as people would like to know what their governments really do, more than to hear what their governments hear about their government's cover-ups. And just as people would prefer to know what so many businesses really do in contrast to what they claim to do, so it would be enormously relieving to know what really happened in history. There could be multiple points of view on this, and the procedure could be to present more than one program on, say, what Belgium did in Congo. In a democracy, the public could thrive on controversy based on matters of real human significance, which mass media usually tend to avoid and to replace with spectator sport, angry talk programs, very brief news reports, advertising, and fake reality TV. Once people knew what really went on, and in many ways still goes on, this is one aspect of what is now called globalization, they might concern themselves with what to do about it now. We could acknowledge the people whose lives were brutalized then by honoring their history and compensating their descendants who continue to suffer from those daring, if demented, forays into other cultures and the brilliance and depredations that accompanied that. The savings gained by drastically cutting defense budgets would, as I imagine it, go in two directions. One would address the sustainability needs of the population of the country shifting funds away from war. The other would take the form of reparations to the victim countries of colonial and imperial practices. If you think all this sounds fanciful, listen now to my closing idea for a significant move from war culture to peace culture. Once war ends, not in our lifetimes, of course, but eventually, it would seem proper to erect a gigantic museum in its honor. I'm calling this the world's largest museum. Imagine a museum that traced the history of war and all its weapons. Exhibits of rocks and slingshots and bows and arrows, daggers and knives and spears, pistols and rifles and machine guns, cannons and missiles and rocket launchers, bombs all the way from tiny ones that blow up a few people to nuclear ones that could destroy life on our planet. Imagine displays on the early development of war and agricultural societies, and then the progressive sophistication of methods and scope of killing. There would be thousands of pictures from many different wars of horribly destroyed bodies of soldiers and civilians, of cities bombed to smithereens and left in ruins, of countless women raped and killed, of fetuses torn from their mothers' wombs, of babies ripped from their mothers' arms and bayoneted to death. There would be pictures of mass hangings, of firing squads, of fleeing troops incinerated, of buildings and cars and bridges blowing up with people in and on them. There would be scenes of environments ravaged by fires, burning oil, blown up dams, forests destroyed by chemical agents, screaming people's bodies on fire. There would be images of bulldozers plowing entire villages under, of people herded into churches and mosques and synagogues and houses and bunkers and caves and railroad cars and burned alive, and a special display of two cities leveled by nuclear bombs that pulverized and even vaporized hundreds of thousands of people and dissolved into dust nearly every building in sight. There would be galleries showing field hospitals with soldiers and civilians' bodies mangled hideously but not beyond repair, and other pictures of soldiers and civilians' bodies so shockingly burned and deformed as to be unrecognizable as ever having been human and alive. Saws that cut off ruined limbs before their anesthetics would be shown, as would all manner of other surgical instruments used to try to save those wounded in war. The survivors of these operations would be shown in their varying glory, misery, and sadness. There would be photo and text essays on merchants who became amazingly rich, selling uniforms that would dissolve in the first rain on the battlefield. Halls of infamy showing people who made huge piles of money selling battleships and airplanes and munitions, and revelations of who campaigned for wars so that they could make more money still, and more money and still more money off death. There would be presentations of mass graves from countless wars all over the world, and exhibits of torture chambers and jails where some prisoners of war have been treated with respect and dignity, and others have been brutalized so viciously and sadistically as to sicken the beholder unto nausea. There would be gigantic halls with real chariots and tanks, real warships and airplanes, real bombs and missiles, and rooms with video games such as those used by the military to teach effective killing. Large screens would show carefully documented and produced films on the history of war and on specific wars and specific battles. These would be located throughout the museum. There would be halls of propaganda showing how it is created in historical instance after historical instance of how it was actually used. Thousands of posters will be on display of hideous caricatures that make the enemy look like fanged devils and one's own side look pristine. There will be audio and video and DVD recordings playing speeches, complete with translations into many languages, where leaders incite their publics to war. There will be rooms dedicated to the nobility of patriotism and how people are sucked into fervent love of nation that blots out realities of actual people in cities and environments dying in war. These rooms will also reveal the limits of patriotism. They will show how a legitimate love of country can be manipulated into hatred for other countries and other peoples. The museum would need to show how there have been choices when wars were fought. Wars could have been averted, and those options will need to be presented in still another part of the museum. By not holding back showing the horrors of killing, mutilation, and the enormous destructiveness of buildings, cities, landscapes, the museum can concentrate in one place the range of the negative aspects and meanings of war. The museum would necessarily present the history of nonviolence ideas and successes of nonviolence in order to recognize that conflicts exist and that there is more than one way to address them, even very large conflicts between nations. In 2008, the United States or Israel or both, fearing Iran was preparing to build nuclear weapons, could have made war on Iran, but that war did not happen, at least so far. Like nonviolence, diplomacy is sometimes a successful alternative to war. All this, as I imagine it, would be installed in one of the most gigantic buildings of all time, the Pentagon. Let this bastion of war planning and war making finally become the World Museum of the Nature, History, Technology, and Consequences of War. We'll call it for short the War Museum. Would it not be fitting for a structure representing all war buildings and war everywhere to be transformed into a museum that will show the details of what war was, and by then, hopefully, no longer has to be? Imagine witnessing the remarkable process by which the Pentagon morphs into the War Museum, and then walking the corridors whose purpose had been planning and making wars, now transformed into memorializing war and honoring those who died in it. By bringing together aspects of the technology, politics, economics, anthropology, psychology, sociology, and history of war into one gigantic building, this War Museum could expose people in one vast complex place to what war has been through history since its advent with agriculture, showing the true costs of war in terms of money spent, humans killed, resources depleted, and environments compromised, might help persuade growing numbers of people that war is not necessary and also is not a good idea, and that war can end. War will not end by wishing it so. It will end when we have as full and astute analyses as we can for why war happens and how to move past it. I can think of no nobler effort, and I intend to spend the rest of my life, which I hope will be long, helping us move ever closer toward this goal. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Fellman.
Okay.
I think we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Fine. This is the first time I presented this in public, so I'm really, really eager to get a reaction. And everything goes, okay? I am not fragile. I can take whatever criticisms you have. I also welcome endorsements, yes.
Can I make a vast generality?
Sure.
Okay. For most human creatures, peaceful existence in a vacuum of non-creativity is incredibly boring.
Uh-huh.
So you have to have something. Just to
The only way to have life not boring is to kill?
No, to live a peaceful existence
Yeah.
today, for the most part,
Uh-huh.
after I visualize America
Uh-huh.
and our culture, I think it's impossible. And it would be too boring if they lived a peaceful existence, because there would be nothing to replace the violence that we survive on.
Switzerland hasn't had a war for 500 years. Do you think they're all dying of boredom?
I'll go you 500.
Well, no, what I'm saying is, I know what you're saying, and that is one of the arguments for war. It makes people feel alive, and well, quote, 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 and it's exciting and so on. All I'm suggesting as a sociologist, there are many alternatives to that. There are many ways for people can feel alive. Let me give you a small example of one way people can feel alive. In love, okay? Which is more important? Remember, those of you who are as old as I am or nearly, make love, not war? Well, that was not just a cheap slogan. It was also an idea, which is that the fulfillment and excitement and so on that can go into work and also go into love. That may sound corny, but it's true. Or into creativity. You know, to create sustainable communities would be very exciting. I have a student who's spending a semester an internship where she works at a community farm near Brandeis, right? She loves it. She goes into ecstasies about what community farming is, what organic farming is. I mean, all these things are possible ways of having meaning and excitement. But I know what you're saying. I mean, my wife and I went to a movie once at a mall that has, a dozen theaters, and all but one of the previews were about things blowing up. Bridges, people, cities, countries, planets, and so on. But what I'm claiming, and there's no time to develop it now, is there are many ways to replace the excitement of war that I think would be more fulfilling for more people than war, actually. Yeah. Other, please, anywhere, yes.
I remember during the Vietnam War, it was pretty exciting to be a protester.
Uh-huh, right.
We don't see much of that anymore. I mean, there are protests, but they're not like they were then.
Well, one of my disappointments is that the current student generation has not done much to oppose the war in Iraq. There are two answers to that, why that is. One is the draft, right? You know, we know that there wouldn't have been that Vietnam protest without the, and the other is technology. A student told me, I have no idea how representative she is, she said she and many of her friends spend more time on Facebook than they do on their studies. There was no Facebook during the Vietnam period, nor were there cell phones, nor was there texting, nor was there Twitter, and so on and so forth. So in some very complex ways, the high-tech advanced technologies draw people away from other things. I mean, I spend a lot of time on emails, so do you, right? Probably. Yes, we have not had that kind of event, that kind of excitement. And I think by now, part of what I get from my students right now is a feeling of being overwhelmed, you know. I mean, what can you do? Who am I? I'm nobody. Now, the feeling of who am I? I'm nobody, I can do nothing, is not something they're born with. They learn that. That's a learned feeling. It comes from all kinds of places. It comes from the media, it comes from the political system, it comes from the education system, it comes in lots of places, sometimes from parents too. And it's a huge thing to take on. I teach a course I invented some years ago with some students' help called Sociology of Empowerment, which addresses this. And where we are right now this semester is about half the students in the class feel totally helpless and disempowered, and the other half feel empowered. And I can hardly wait to see how it's going to go. Other, yes?
I'm wondering how you might want to respond to the discourse about the purification or kind of necessary cleansing process that violent destruction provides for nature, for societies, for ideas.
Well, purification. Explain more what you mean by purification.
Well, I think about natural processes that happen
Uh-huh.
in the world, say the need for fire in order to
Yeah.
bring some seedlings to life.
Right.
And I think that destruction in some ways is a natural occurrence and is required in some ways for life to go on. And I see that we mirror that
Yeah.
in human
Right.
history. And I'm wondering how you might respond to that idea that maybe it's necessary, maybe purification is
Yeah.
violent is necessary.
Well, something has happened to war in the last 100 years. If you read the run-up to the First World War, an awful lot of people, including very highly educated, cultured people in Europe, were excited about having a war. They thought it was wonderful. Sigmund Freud was excited that his sons would go to war. He thought it was a terrific thing, you know, German assertion, blah, blah, blah. By the end of the war, he had changed his mind rather profoundly. But there had been a romance about war, which is not quite over, but it's almost over. That war does great things. It makes men out of boys and so on and so forth. When you talk about purification, I'm assuming you're meaning social change of certain kinds, right? Well, there are ways to have social change without war, too. I mean, if I have learned recently that forest fires are often good for the forest, all right? You know, that you can't have all that, I mean, whatever, it's good to have the regeneration. The analogy doesn't hold for human beings, I think. We are not trees, and societies are not forests. Humans have the capacity to design their own lives and to analyze them. One thing that distinguishes us from all of the species is we can reflect on ourselves and make choices. You know, lions can't do that. And so
That was the critical point, that human beings are not forests.
we're not forests, yeah. We make our own lives, we make decisions about our own lives. And I think what you're talking about is a kind of a romanticized notion that war purifies, war is glorious, and so on. And there are many reasons why I think that is really over. For one thing, there was I was not in an army, by the way. So I've never been at war or even in military training. But there was a time when war was at least hand to hand or weapon to weapon. And I don't approve of this, nor do I think it was good, but we can't undo the wars we had. But at least if it's me against him, one of us is going to come out because he's stronger, clever, or something. It's not hand to hand. You know, our army is working on weapons that don't even have people in them. You know, planes that have no people flying them. The idea is to kill long distance, to dehumanize and depersonalize so completely that there's nobody there. You know, there's nobody there. Who did you kill? Nobody. I don't know. You know, we saw Vietnam on television. We didn't see Iraq on television. Very carefully, we did not see the mangled bodies of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi civilians and so on and so forth. And I think if we had more time, and we don't, but to take your comment about purification, there are many ways a society can purify. I'll tell you a way I think our society can purify itself right now. That's the ways I was talking about here. By ending war, we would purify ourselves of the rot and scum, really, of killing and of these. I mean, it offends me unbelievably that billions of dollars are spent on submarines that are never going to be used. There is no reason for them. Hyman Rickover, I can't find it. Google has not helped me on this, but I remember when Hyman Rickover retired as the head of the nuclear Navy, he said we didn't need 40 nuclear submarines. All we ever needed was one. And yet he supervised building 40. So the purification would come through being honest and not being wasteful, and through joining with humanity, too. We have a capacity now, and this never happened in the world before. This is the upside of globalization, by the way. We have the capacity now to identify and recognize everybody as human. We can do that instantly. That was never possible before. Yes?
How can we wean ourselves economically from war? It's such, this expenditures on it, the power of,
Yes.
of the military-industrial complex is such that it seems like an impossible task.
It's vast for several reasons. The military-industrial people managed very cleverly to make sure they had major installations in all 50 states, all right? So every state has senators and congresspeople who don't want to lose those jobs, right? That's part of what they've done. Another part of what they've done is to have lobbyists that make sure that all these weapon systems, which have no use whatsoever, are built, and who pay those congresspeople and senators to take offices, and in those offices to defend their interests and so on. I mean, a lot is called for. I'm an academic. I'm not, a political figure. But among things that are called for, I think, is revamping the whole idea of lobbying. I mean, I don't mind that there are insurance companies lobbying the health issue, but I'm outraged that we don't have equally powerful citizens' lobbies also lobbying. But where would the money come from for citizens' lobbies, There's something profoundly undemocratic to me about corporations being able to lobby their interests when citizens can't lobby theirs. So that's a piece of it. And the economic conversion, which I'll mention this very briefly again, is a process. It was started, I'll give you the one clear example of this, was in England about 20 or 30 years ago. The British government decided to stop making a certain fighter plane, right? And the factory that was making that plane was going to close. The workers in the factory got together over a several-year period and worked out a design for how they could keep their tools, their skills, their factories on in such a way as to do something entirely other than making fighter planes. The only thing I remember offhand, of the rest is in my book, is kidney dialysis machines. But they went to management and said, here's a way we can keep ourselves employed. You can continue making money. We'll keep this whole thing going. Management said, no. You don't tell us what to do. We're closing the factory. And they did, right? So there are ways, and it would not be even that hard to get people together. People in factories who make bombs or whatever are not dumb. They can think of ways to use their skills in other ways. And we could have national commissions that would begin to talk about not only national mass transit systems, but lots of things we need and could use. But it takes imagination, it takes courage, but that's how it'll be done. Either that, or the war thing keeps going and we all die. I mean, I foresee that we can just kill ourselves from the momentum of what we have. Yes?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Right.
Yes?
In the context of your ideas, how do you assess what President Obama has done, and what prospect do you have for him?
You talking about in Afghanistan?
No, as president.
Oh, in general? Well, Obama I find really interesting for many reasons. One is he doesn't seem, well, he's passed up the idea of war with Iran, all right? He wants to go about that one diplomatically. He has been awfully hesitant on the Israeli-Palestinian thing, where many of us were hoping he would be more forceful. I don't want to get into that. That's a whole hornet's nest, I realize. In Afghanistan, I'm simply puzzled and disappointed. All the evidence points to you can't defeat Afghanistan. Historically, it simply hasn't been done. And I wonder, I have no evidence for this, but I wonder if Obama, who seems to be quite centered, he seems to be really in command of himself. I mean, we had, this is my developmental analysis of the presidency. Bill Clinton was an adolescent. George Bush was a toddler. And Barack Obama strikes me as an adult, and it's reassuring to have an adult in office. He doesn't seem to have to play around with some of the silly things that some recent presidents have. But I just wonder if and by the way, I doubt that his manhood has to be shored up by making war in Afghanistan either. But my sense of Obama is that he has a deep commitment to kind of balancing everything off and trying to satisfy this party and that party and some other party. And that to say absolutely, we're going to stop this war in Afghanistan now, would bring him so much flack that he doesn't seem, I'm guessing he doesn't want to get. I think one of his tasks, and by the way, I write speeches for Obama every day in my car on my way to Brandeis. I mean, I've written him so many speeches. And my wife says, send it to him! I'm always going to read. Anyway, but one thing I would love for him to do is to take on the clear and well worked out strategy of the far right now and analyze it and reveal it. Reveal it. You have all of these entertainers. I call them adversary entertainers, right? Limbaugh and O'Reilly and Beck and all that. And their task is to destroy, to be as vicious and rotten as possible. And see, I think what happens is this. The far right wants to get back into office, all right? Desperately, anything to get back in office. Why? Because when the far right is in office, the very rich get richer, all right? I would have, one of my speeches that I've written, Obama, over every polling place, I would put that whatever the Republicans say, whatever their ideology, whatever their philosophy, what they do is to make the rich richer, all right? That's their raison d'etre, all right? Well, you can't get elected by saying, let's make the rich richer. So instead, you say, oh, you're against abortion? I am too, Or you're worried about gun rights? Hey, man, guns are for everybody. But what they've done is to try, they have desperately to distract attention. I think it is absolutely brilliant, I mentioned that in my remarks, to take the anger that people have toward the healthcare system and point it at Obama. I mean, it's extraordinary. What a brilliant device that is. Here's a guy who has a very, very excellent mind and a lot of smart people around him really trying to do something to healthcare. And then they invent, I'm sure Karl Rove is behind this, but I have no evidence, but it just feels like Karl, death panels, Yes, there are death panels. They're called insurance companies. They decide who dies, not the federal government. It's the insurance companies who are the death panels. Some of you may have seen, there's a thing going around on email that one of my colleagues sent me of signs from a recent English-only demonstration or something like that, but everybody should speak only English. And all of these signs are illiterate. All of them misspell words, right? And my favorite one, which combines with the healthcare thing, says, Asian youths want to kill your grandma, right? Get that? Euthanasia is understood by some people. I'm not kidding you. I'll send it. Asian youths want to kill your grandma. So you think, oh my God, tapping into ignorance, into illiteracy, the rage that should be going toward the healthcare system as it is, and lots of other things, is simply wham. Don't you love it when these people have said, don't get the government involved in my Medicare? What are you talking about? I mean, and where do you go with it? What do you do in the classroom if somebody says that? I mean, it's hard enough in the classroom. What do you do nationally? So I think Obama has a lot to do. I think he's awfully hesitant. I think he's being extremely cautious. I think he doesn't yet get something that I claim in my book on adversarialism, that you can try to, as hard as you can, to be mutualistic with another party. If they won't do it, then you may have to become adversarial with them. You may have to go into it on their terms and really try to overcome them. The Republicans have shown, at least on the healthcare issue, zero interest in accommodating. I mean, zero. And so at some point, I think, if Obama listened to me in my car, I would say, give up on that. Give up on that. Go with the strong. And by the way, then you got the Democrats to worry about, right? This recent X-ray study of Democrats, it turns out 85% of them have no backbones, And the question is, how do they stand up? How do they remain upright without, it's a hard thing. But I think, among other things he has, is these blue dog Democrats who, they're really messing up the thing. Anyway, I love talking, by the way, as you can tell. Yes, woman here has had it for a while.
Let me exercise the moderator's prerogative to ask a question about the relationship between war and peace. In other words, I think your point about moving toward adversarialism, if mutualism doesn't work, is an example of that. Also, mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that at least you have to have a threat of war to have peace, and you have a credible threat if there never is war?
Well, I understand the point, and it's been raised many times. I'm not so sure. I think part of what I try to see the upside of globalization as well as the downside. I think part of the upside is that we're somewhere in the early stages of people's understanding that there's a world, and that we're all part of a world. The nation state, as a political formation, has had it, I think. It's only been around for about 300 years, and it's not going to last forever, and it simply isn't useful anymore. Max Weber, one of the great sociological theorists, defines the nation state as that the largest unit that's capable of using violence against another unit or its own population, right? Well, okay, but if we get past controlling people through using violence, see, part of what Weber couldn't foresee, Marx couldn't either, is the ecological imperatives too. The national boundaries mean nothing when it comes to acid rain or global warming. All this stuff is systemic, it's global. And the nation state simply, for our government through its lobbyists to say, it's too expensive to our economy to ramp down some of what we spend, the coal we use, blah, blah. I mean, it's just silly. I mean, the nation state simply isn't useful in the ecological context. And I think it's no longer useful in terms of the war context either. Nation states make war against each other, right? Now, there's civil wars too. People in countries make war against each other too. But if we can promote, and this is happening, by the way, not on a huge scale, but it's happening. If we can promote awareness, growing awareness, that there are alternatives to war. Gandhi's 140th birthday, I think, is next Friday? I think it's next Friday. Friday next week, really. I mean, Gandhi and there are plenty of people we can look to now, not just as interesting, quaint historical exceptions, but as people who begin to lead the way and who have something to teach us. See, I would go back to that comment earlier about, where's the anti-war movement? Now, this is the time for it. This is really the time for the anti-war movement, only it shouldn't be just against the war in Afghanistan or the war in Iraq. My problem with the anti-Vietnam War movement was it was against the Vietnam War rather than against war. And I think it's time to have a movement against war, not just against a war. It's time to say we don't need this anymore. Yes, your hand's been up for a long time.
Last question, please.
Okay.
Before my question, if I might, call attention to Cleveland Peace Action, which is an affiliate of National Peace Action that used to be St. Freeze, and we have an active chapter here, and we welcome new members, and you can find us on the internet. And thank you for your very exciting discussion. The one thing that I feel that you didn't touch on sufficiently in terms of causes of war, and besides full-blown war, the more hidden interventions that countries perpetuate on other countries. We have done that many, many times around the world, whether it's Haiti, where the Marines go in, and many other places, is the control of resources. And you can see that now. I mean, during the Iraq War, those of us who were demonstrating said no blood for oil, but in fact those contracts are being written by the multinational oil companies now. And Afghanistan is a very strategic area in terms of oil and gas pipelines and so forth. So I feel as though that the great game that has been played forever among countries for power and control of resources could be heightened in your discussion.
Well, yes, and that's a very good point. I mean, one of the reasons for the whole Afghanistan thing has to do with the oil pipeline that goes through Afghanistan. The ideological stuff is often beside the point. You're raising a question which is so huge. If you think what I'm talking about is big, you're talking, and I'm willing to talk about this, about reconstructing the entire economic system of the world. Because if oil is a scarce resource, one way to handle the scarcity is to get as much as you can for yourself and the hell with everybody else. Another way is to apportion it out. You get this much, you get this much. A third way is to do alternate energy. You remember Reagan destroyed the modest alternate energy budget that Carter had set up, right? Well, Obama, I think, is going to get back to that, or is back to it already, perhaps. But I think alternate energy and reconceiving this notion that you take what you can get. I mean, there's a concept in peace studies where I do much of my work that says that the idea of national security is archaic and needs to be replaced with the idea of common security. National security is how can I make my nation strong enough to get what it wants and keep everybody else at bay. Common security means, let's face it, nobody is safe until everybody is safe. Nobody is safe until everybody is safe. There is no other way to look at it. So then we work on how everybody can be safe. We have a United Nations. For 40 years, the Soviet Union and the United States made a mockery of the United Nations, right? Jerking it around, toying with it, opportunistically, cheaply, and viciously. Soviet Union's not there to do that anymore. We can still do it. But I think the United Nations is a place which can be invigorated, let's say, and is a place where logically you can start talking about how do we allocate resources properly. The United Nations could play a better role, although Kofi Annan and other people who've tried get kicked out because the United States could play a much greater role in pushing alternate forms of dispute resolution. You don't have to go to war as often as people have gone to war, but it's so much a part of our economic system and our masculinity system and what I'm calling is our anger diversion system that it's hard. But my feeling is, what the hell? Just take this stuff on. I'll end with an anecdote, and I don't mean for this to be a close analogy, but in the early parts of the anti-Vietnam War movement, I was one day on Boston Common at a major subway stop, sort of central one of the city, with about 20 people protesting the Vietnam War. And people came and they spat on us and, go back to Russia, blah, 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 blah. 2 years later, there were 100,000 people on Boston Common protesting the war. Now, I'm not saying, it's not that if we do a small demonstration now in 2 years, it's gonna be a big one. It's not gonna be that fast. But I think, what I think, and I try to tell my students, is that you start where you are, and you work as hard as you can. And what I claim also is that one reason the 60s fell apart, the movement died, was they had a lousy analysis. It was shallow and it was dumb, and it was wistful. We need much more careful analyses. That's why I think the academy has a role to play in social change. And we need to figure out how to act on our intelligent analyses as best we can. I mean, you know, we keep trying. Okay.
On behalf of Sister and the doctor, we'd like to thank Professor Fellman for a very provocative lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
And also, as a memento of this occasion, we'd like to present him with a very elegant clock. It says Case Western Reserve University School of Law Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Conflict and Dispute Resolution, Professor Gordon Fellman, September 23rd, 2009.
Thank you so much. Wow. Pleasure. I really appreciate this discussion.
We
very much.
really enjoy having you.
Thank
A reception will follow outside.